The structure rising in Janice Kalnins's pasture looked like two buildings fighting for the same piece of land. First, the familiar skeleton of a timber-framed barn went up, its straight lines and sharp angles a comforting sight in the Cheyenne Valley of North Dakota. But then, inside that wooden frame, something alien began to grow. A great, curving ribcage of dark iron, bolted together piece by piece, formed a perfect arch under the gabled roof. While every other settler in that raw country of 1908 was building thicker walls to fight the wind, Janice Kalnins was building a barn within a barn, with a curious gap of air between them. To the men who gathered at the grain elevator, it was madness. Mercer Tilford, the elevator manager and a man who understood the hard calculus of freight costs and crop spoilage, declared it a shipbuilder's folly. He'd watched the heavy, rolled iron plates come off the Sioux Line flat car, and he'd calculated the cost. A cost that could have bought enough timber for 2 proper cabins. He saw a homesteader wasting his last dollar on a metal shell that everyone knew would turn to a house of ice, a place where condensation would rain from the ceiling and ruin anything stored within. What no one understood, what Tilford couldn't see, was that Janice Kalnins wasn't building a wall to stop the prairie wind. He was building a shape to shed it, a shape he had learned on the shores of a different, colder sea. The question that hung in the autumn air was simple and brutal. Had he brought wisdom, or had he brought ruin? The story of how this strange, nested structure came to be is a lesson in how survival sometimes depends on knowledge the land itself has never seen. If you stick with us, we'll explore the forgotten physics of wind pressure reduction, the simple genius of a convective-killing annulus, and the moment a team of sweating horses proved a room full of experts wrong. If you find value in these stories of quiet ingenuity, consider subscribing to our channel and letting us know in the comments what unconventional building method you've always found fascinating. We promise the history and the science will be worth your time. Janice Kalnins was not a farmer. He had come to North Dakota for the land, but his hands did not know the language of soil and seed. He was not a carpenter, accustomed to the scent of pine and the predictable geometry of milled lumber. He was a plater, a man whose trade was written in steel. His memory was not of forests, but of the sprawling shipyards of Riga, on the Latvian coast of the Baltic Sea. His muscles were conditioned to the clang of the riveting hammer, the groan of the rolling mill, and the searing heat radiating from a forge. His world had been one of curved hull plates, massive steel skeletons designed to withstand the crushing pressure of ice and the relentless assault of North Sea gales. He had spent 15 years on his knees fitting and fastening the skin of ocean-going vessels. He understood, in a way no prairie carpenter could, the profound strength of a curve. He had watched 1,000-ton plates, bent into a shallow arch, deflect blows that would have shattered any flat surface. He knew that a straight wall meets the wind like a fist, inviting a fight it will eventually lose. A curved wall, however, meets the wind like an open hand guiding it, shedding its force, remaining stable and quiet under unimaginable pressure. He also knew the secrets of the space between. Every ship had a double hull, a void between the outer skin that met the sea and the inner skin that held the cargo. This air gap, he had learned, was a buffer against the penetrating cold of the northern waters. When he arrived in the Cheyenne Valley with his wife Elza and their young son, Lucas, he brought this knowledge with him, locked away like a set of specialized tools for which he had not yet found a use. They spent their first winter, that of 1907, in a standard homesteader's box cabin, a 16 by 20-foot structure of green cottonwood logs, chinked with mud and grass. It was a miserable education in the physics of prairie weather. The cabin did not stand against the wind, it trembled. On nights when the northern gales swept down from Canada, the entire structure would shake on its foundation sills. A fine powder of dust from the dried chinking would sift down from the walls, coating their blankets and fouling their food. The wind didn't just blow against the walls. It pushed, creating immense constant pressure that forced the cold through every unseen crack and joint. The cold was not a presence. It was an invasion. The iron latch on the inside of their door was often glazed white with a thick layer of frost, a perfect image of the heat being sucked directly through the wood and metal. Elsa would leave a basin of wash water on the stand beside the stove while she prepared supper, and by the time the meal was ready, a thin skin of ice would have formed on its surface. They slept in their coats, huddled together under every blanket they owned, yet the cold seeped into their bones. Janice burned through his entire winter's supply of firewood by January and was forced to spend desperate, freezing days scavenging for more, his face raw from the wind. He watched the other settlers, good men and experienced farmers, fight the same losing battle. They chinked their walls tighter in the autumn, banked them with sod, and stuffed them with newspaper. But the result was always the same. The cold found a way in. The wind always won. One afternoon, during a particularly vicious blow, Janice stood inside his shuddering cabin and watched a candle flame on the table. It wasn't flickering randomly. It was bent over, leaning steadily away from the north wall, as if in a constant draft. But there was no open window, no obvious hole. He realized then that the entire wall was porous. The wind was pressing its way through the very fabric of the building. In that moment, his mind left the prairie and returned to the shipyards of Riga. He saw the elegant, sweeping curve of a ship's bow, parting a frozen sea. He saw the immense, quiet strength of the arched hull. The prairie, he understood with sudden, crystalline clarity, was just another kind of ocean, and the wind was just another kind of water. He would not build another box to be broken. He would build a hull to stand on the plains. To understand the genius of what Janice Kalnins was about to build, one must first understand the comprehensive failure of what it was replacing. The standard homesteader cabin was a masterpiece of economy and speed, but it was a thermal catastrophe, a design fundamentally at war with the environment of the Great Plains. Its failure was not one of materials or craftsmanship, but of physics. The primary flaw was its shape. A flat vertical wall is the most inefficient form imaginable for resisting wind. When a 50-mile-per-hour gust slams into a flat surface, it stops dead, transferring nearly 100% of its kinetic energy into direct pressure. In the Cheyenne Valley, this pressure could exceed 20 pounds per square foot. For a typical cabin wall, this meant the wind was exerting a constant, shuddering force of several thousand pounds. This immense pressure didn't just seek out existing cracks, it created new ones. It torqued the window frames, flexed the door jambs, and worked the chinking loose from between the logs. The structure itself was acting as a giant bellows, constantly inhaling the frigid outside air. This process is called infiltration, and it was the single greatest thief of heat on the prairie. Inside the cabin, this infiltration created a cascade of secondary failures. The cold, dense air pouring in through the north and west walls would sink to the floor, creating a river of cold that flowed across the room. This river pushed the warmer, lighter air from the stove upwards towards the ceiling. This created a powerful convective loop. The settlers felt this as a constant, inexplicable draft, even when the cabin was sealed tight. Their heads would be sweating while their feet were freezing. The stove could be glowing red hot, consuming cordwood at an alarming rate, but its heat was being immediately organized and stolen by this internal weather system. The BTUs, the actual units of heat energy, were being efficiently collected by the moving air and delivered directly to the cold inner surfaces of the walls and ceiling, where they were lost to the outside. The neighbors were all trapped in this same cycle. The Schmidt family, Germans from the Volga region, had tried to insulate their walls by stuffing them with straw, but moisture migrating from inside the cabin condensed on the cold outer logs, turning the straw into a frozen, sodden mass that had almost no insulating value. The O'Malley brothers, who ran a small cattle operation, built their cabin with thicker, more carefully notched logs. It was stronger, but no warmer. The heat simply conducted more slowly through the thicker wood, but it still escaped. The physics of conduction and convection were relentless. Mercer Tilford, from his vantage point at the grain elevator, saw the economic consequences of this failure. He saw homesteaders spending vital capital on extra wagon loads of coal from the east. He saw them burning through wood they should have been saving for fencing. He saw men forced to abandon their claims after a brutal winter, their resources exhausted, their spirits broken by the sheer, grinding effort of staying warm. The problem felt intractable. The conventional wisdom offered only one solution: more. More wood, more chinking, more banking, more fuel. It was a strategy of brute force, and it was failing all across the valley. No one was thinking about shape. No one was considering that the answer wasn't to build a stronger wall, but to build a smarter one. The problem, as Janice Kalnins alone seemed to understand, wasn't the cold. It was the wind. Defeat the wind, and the cold could be managed. In the late summer of 1908, Janice Kalnins made a decision that baffled his neighbors and confirmed, in Mercer Tilford's mind, his foolishness. He sold a mature team of draft horses and a 10-acre parcel of his southern pasture, prime haying land, to the O'Malley brothers. With the cash, he didn't buy more cattle or better farm equipment. He placed a special order with the Sioux Line Railroad freight agent for 2 tons of rolled steel plate, untamed, to be delivered from the ironworks in Duluth. The cost, including the staggering freight charges, consumed nearly every dollar he had. The work began in September. First, he and a hired hand erected the post and beam frame of a large conventional barn, 40 feet long and 24 feet wide. It was a familiar, reassuring sight. Men riding by on the main track would nod in approval. Kalnins, it seemed, was finally building something sensible, a proper shelter for his livestock and hay. The frame was sturdy, made of thick cottonwood timbers hewn from the river bottom. It looked like any other barn in the valley. Then, in early October, the flat car arrived at the siding. On it were stacked the curved sections of dark iron, each 8 feet long and 2 feet wide, pre-drilled with holes along their edges. The mood in the valley shifted from approval to bewilderment. What was a farmer doing with the skin of a boiler or a steamship? Janice and his 10-year-old son, Lucas, began the second phase of construction. They started at one end of the timber frame, laying a sill plate on the dirt floor. Then they took the first section of iron. Together, they lifted it into place, resting its bottom edge on the sill. Janice held it steady while Lucas fitted bolts through the holes. Then they lifted the next section, overlapping it by a few inches, and bolted it fast. The work was slow, methodical, and loud. This was the construction's signature moment. Each time Janice's wrench tightened a bolt, the hollow iron curve would ring with a low, resonant gong. It was a sound utterly alien to that landscape of wood and earth. It wasn't the familiar thud of a hammer driving a nail into timber. It was a deep, metallic note that echoed across the harvested fields, the sound of a shipyard breaking the prairie silence. Neighbors heard it from a half-mile away and shook their heads. It was the sound of money being wasted, of a fool announcing his project to the entire county. Day by day, the arch grew inside the wooden skeleton. Janice was meticulous, ensuring a precise, uniform gap between the outer edge of the iron and the inner posts of the timber frame. He measured it constantly, 18 inches, no more, no less. When the arch was complete, a perfect, dark tunnel running the length of the barn. The third phase began. He bought dozens of straw bales from his neighbors for pennies on the dollar, the leftover waste from the threshing season. He and Lucas began to pack them, tightly, into the 18-inch annulus. They wedged them in, cutting bales to fit perfectly around the timber posts, creating a thick, seamless blanket of insulation that was hidden from view, a secret tucked between the wood and the steel. It was during this phase that Mercer Tilford paid his visit. He rode out on his bay mare, tying it to the outer frame. He was not an unkind man, but he was a practical one, and he felt it was his duty to warn the Latvian of the disaster he was engineering. He found Janice inside the structure, stuffing straw into the northern wall. "Kalnins," Tilford began, his voice echoing slightly in the strange space. "I don't mean to tell you your business, but I manage the grain shipments for this whole valley. I know what moisture does." Janice paused, a piece of baling twine in his hand. He said nothing. Tilford gestured at the iron ceiling. "That iron will weep condensation all winter. Every bit of warmth from your animals, your stove, your own breath. It's going to hit that cold metal and turn to water. You'll have a rainstorm inside your own walls. Any grain you put in that loft," he pointed to the upper level of the timber frame, above the arch, "will be black with mold by spring. You've wasted a fortune in freight on a pile of rust." His logic was sound, based on every known principle of construction in that climate. Metal was cold. Warm, moist air hitting a cold surface made water. It was simple, undeniable. Janice Kalnins looked at the wall he was packing. He pushed a loose bit of straw deeper into a crevice. He looked at Tilford. "The straw will be dry," he said. It wasn't an argument. It was a statement of fact. Then he turned back to his work. Tilford stared for a moment, frustrated by the man's quiet certainty. He had offered sound, practical advice, and it had been met with a cryptic, three-word dismissal. He shook his head, mounted his horse, and rode away, convinced he had just witnessed the construction of the most expensive, elaborate failure in the history of the county. By the end of October, the structure was complete. At the eastern end of the arch, Janice framed in living quarters for his family, a large open room with a cast-iron stove, a sleeping area, and a kitchen. The rest of the long space was left open for his milk cow, a few pigs, and his workshop. From the outside, it looked like a barn. From the inside, it felt like something else entirely. A cave, a tunnel, a hull. It was waiting for the storm. The brilliance of the design was invisible, hidden in the 18-inch gap between wood and iron. What Mercer Tilford saw was a metal building that would sweat. What he failed to see was a sophisticated thermal engine, designed around three distinct physical principles. First was wind pressure reduction. When the brutal north wind, traveling unimpeded for hundreds of miles, finally struck the Kalnins homestead, it would first hit the conventional timber and plank wall of the outer barn. This wall would absorb the initial shock, breaking the wind's momentum, but some of that force would still pass through the gaps in the planking, swirling into the annulus. Here, it met the second crucial surface, the smooth, curved iron of the inner arch. A flat wall, as established, fights the wind. A curved wall, by its very geometry, sheds it. The wind pressure, unable to find a perpendicular surface to push against, would be deflected upwards and around the arch. The actual force exerted on the inner living space was reduced by an estimated 60 to 70%. While other cabins shuddered and groaned under the strain, Janice's inner sanctum would remain still and quiet, the wind's power largely neutralized before it ever reached the place where his family lived. The second and most important principle was the annihilation of the convective loop. Heat is lost in three ways: conduction through solid materials, radiation as infrared energy, and convection through the movement of air or liquid. In a standard cabin, convection is the greatest enemy. The Calnan's barn attacked it directly. The 18 inches of densely packed straw bales in the annulus served as a massive barrier to air movement. A typical log wall might have an R value, a measure of its resistance to heat flow, of around 8. A simple plank wall was less than R4. The combination of the outer planking, the air pockets within the straw itself, and the inner iron wall created a composite system with an R value conservatively estimated at over R40, a number unheard of at the time. This didn't just slow the loss of heat. It killed the engine that drove it. Because the inner iron wall was so thoroughly insulated from the outside temperature, it never got cold enough for significant condensation to form. The dew point, the temperature at which water vapor in the air condenses into liquid, was never reached on that inner surface. The warm, moist air inside the living space would touch the iron wall, but the wall was only a few degrees cooler than the air itself. Mercer Tilford's prediction of an indoor rainstorm was based on the behavior of a single, uninsulated sheet of metal. Janice had built a thermal shield. The straw would indeed stay dry. Finally, there was the principle of radiant heat. The concave shape of the arch worked like a reflector. Heat from the wood stove, from the animals, and from the family themselves would rise, hit the curved ceiling, and be radiated back down, distributed evenly across the entire living space. Unlike in a box cabin, where heat pooled uselessly at the ceiling, the arch actively focused the warmth back onto the inhabitants. It created a gentle, encompassing warmth, like being cupped in a warm hand. It was an environment of profound thermal stability, a calm island in an ocean of atmospheric violence. Janus Calnans hadn't just built a shelter, he had engineered a microclimate. The blizzard arrived on the 3rd of December. It began not with snow, but with a sky the color of slate and a wind that had a voice. For a day it was just a gale, a prelude that stripped the last dead leaves from the cottonwoods and sent dust devils dancing across the frozen fields. Then the temperature began to plummet. By nightfall, it was 10 below zero. By the next morning, it was 25 below, and the snow began. It wasn't a gentle snow. It flew horizontally, a blinding white sheet of ice particles driven by winds that gusted to 50 miles per hour. The world beyond the walls vanished. There was no sky, no ground, only a screaming, featureless white void. For 6 days, the Cheyenne Valley was held in the blizzard's grip. The temperature bottomed out at 34 degrees below zero, not accounting for the wind chill, which was a concept too terrifying to calculate. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a battle for survival. At the Schmidt homestead, they huddled around their stove, feeding it precious wood. The stovepipe glowed a dull cherry red, yet 5 feet away the air was so cold their breath plumed. The walls were coated in a thick, crystalline layer of frost. They had ceased to be a home and had become a poorly sealed tomb, the family entombed with the cold. The O'Malley brothers, Tian with a larger stock of firewood, fared better, but by the 4th day their supply was dangerously low. They took to burning fence posts, then a broken wagon wheel, anything to keep the fire alive. Their cattle, in a simple lean-to, began to freeze where they stood. Inside the Calnan structure, life continued with an almost unnerving sense of normalcy. The shriek of the wind was a distant, muffled howl, the sound of a beast prowling far outside the gate. There were no drafts. The air was still and cool, but not cold. The big cast-iron stove required feeding only every few hours, consuming wood at a placid, steady rate. Elsa was able to do a small load of laundry, and she hung the damp clothes on a line strung across the room. To the astonishment of anyone who might have witnessed it, they actually dried. 10-year-old Lucas, who in the old cabin would have been bundled in every layer he owned, was able to sit on the wooden floor and play with his carved toys, his hands bare. The ultimate proof of their comfort was a simple, daily ritual. Every evening, Janice brought in a pail of fresh milk from their cow, which was housed comfortably in the livestock section of the barn. He would place the pail on a low shelf in their kitchen area, not particularly close to the stove. In any other dwelling in the valley, that pail of milk would have been a solid block of ice by morning, requiring a hatchet to get at it. But each dawn, when Elsa went to the pail, the milk was still liquid. It poured. A small, quiet miracle that testified to a profound victory. The cold had not been kept at bay. It had been defeated. On the fourth day of the blizzard, a hammering sound came from the large wooden door of the outer barn. It was faint against the wind, but persistent. Janice pulled on his coat and boots, went into the annulus, and slid the heavy door open a crack. A figure, caked in snow and ice, stumbled inside. It was Gus, one of Mercer Tilford's teamsters. He had been trying to get a load of feed to an outlying farm when the blizzard had hit its full fury. His team of 2 massive percherons was exhausted, and he had become disoriented in the whiteout. He had stumbled upon the Calnans' place by sheer luck. "My team," Gus stammered, his beard a mask of ice. "They can't go on. The depot can't make it back." Janice nodded, closing the door against the storm. "Bring them inside," he said. "There is room in the aisle." The vindication of Janice Calnans' design came not with a formal declaration or a public apology, but with the quiet testimony of 2 sweating horses. For 2 days after Gus the teamster sought refuge, the blizzard continued its assault. Inside the arch, the 2 families and the animals coexisted in a state of stable, draft-free calm. Gus, a man of few words and deep experience with prairie winters, was quietly mystified. He had spent his life in drafty barns and freezing depots. He had never experienced a shelter of this size that felt so still. The air didn't move. The cold didn't bite. When the wind finally subsided on the 6th day, leaving behind a world sculpted in massive snowdrifts under a piercingly blue sky, Mercer Tilford assembled a small party to search for his missing man and his valuable team. He was worried, expecting the worst. He imagined finding Gus suffering from frostbite, his horses frozen or near death. He followed the line of the main track, and it was his knowledge of the land that led him to the Calnans' homestead, which was half buried in a sweeping drift. He slid off his own shivering horse, its coat laced with frost, and pushed his way through the deep snow to the main barn door. He slid it open, preparing himself for the biting cold he knew he would find inside. He expected to see his own breath explode in a cloud of vapor. Instead, a wave of mild, animal-scented air washed over his face. It wasn't warm like a house, but it was utterly free of the needle-sharp sting of the -30-degree air outside. His eyes adjusted to the dim light. And then he saw it. His certainty was that a large, unheated space, especially one made of iron, would be only marginally warmer than the outside. He knew that animals in such a barn would be covered in frost, their own body heat wicked away by the frigid materials around them. He expected to see his percherons, 2 of the finest draft horses in the county, shivering violently under layers of blankets. The physical observation that broke this certainty was simple and profound. The 2 massive horses were standing calmly in the central aisle. They were not wearing blankets. Their dark gray coats, from flank to shoulder, were damp and slick. In the still, cool air of the barn, they were sweating. Tilford took off a glove and reached out, touching the nearest horse's flank. It was warm and wet to the touch. He looked at the team, then at his own horse waiting outside, trembling and frosted. The contrast was absolute, a physical argument that no amount of theory could refute. The structure was not just sheltering the animals from the wind, it was trapping their own body heat so efficiently that they were overheating in the middle of the worst blizzard in a decade. Gus walked over from the living quarters, holding a mug of coffee. "Damnedest thing, Mr. Tilford," he said, his voice full of a kind of weary awe. "Had to take their blankets off 'em the first night. They were getting too warm." Tilford said nothing. He simply stared up at the vast dark curve of the iron ceiling, then over at Janice Calnan's, who was quietly forking hay for his own cow. He saw the still air, the dry floor, the placid animals. The shipbuilder's folly was the warmest, safest shelter in the entire valley. In that moment, Tilford wasn't looking at a barn. He was looking at the inside of a closed fist, held against the wind. Mercer Tilford was a man of commerce. His world was one of ledgers, freight manifests, and profit margins. When he was proven wrong, he did not waste time on pride. He adjusted his calculations. He saw the sweating horses not just as a marvel, but as an economic advantage. Horses that weren't shivering were horses that required less feed. A structure that held its heat was a structure that cost less to maintain. A week after the blizzard, Tilford sat in his small, dusty office at the grain elevator. He pulled out his main freight ledger, the thick book that recorded the flow of goods in and out of the valley. He dipped his pen in the inkwell and, in his neat, precise script, wrote out a special order to the rail agent. It was for pre-curved steel plates, enough to build an arched inner shell for 3 of his own wooden grain sidings along the tracks. These smaller buildings were notoriously drafty and suffered from spoilage due to moisture and frost. He had seen the solution at the Calman's place. When the Sioux Line rail agent, a man named Henderson, received the order, he raised an eyebrow. It was an expensive, unusual request. He walked over to the elevator. "Mercer," he asked, "what in blazes are you building with all this iron?" Tilford didn't just give him an answer. He gave him the theory. He explained what he had seen. The still air, the lack of frost, the sweating horses. He explained Janice's idea of the straw-filled annulus and the curved arch. Henderson, who was responsible for a dozen drafty station houses and freight depots up and down the line, listened intently. He saw a solution not just for Tilford's sidings, but for the railroad's own buildings. He approved the freight order, and then he sent a message down the telegraph wire to his counterpart in the next division. The message described a new building method, a nested arch barn, that was proving remarkably effective against the winter winds. The idea began to spread not through neighborly conversation, but through the official, practical channels of commerce and industry. It traveled down the Sioux Line, an innovation carried by the very railroad that had first delivered its raw materials. What Janice Calnan's built in his pasture in 1908 was a precursor to principles that would become central to modern building science. His straw-filled annulus was an early, highly effective form of what engineers now call a super-insulated wall assembly. The concept of creating a thick, airtight barrier to stop convective heat loss is the foundation of modern energy-efficient construction. His structure, with its outer shell acting as a windbreak and its inner shell as the thermal envelope, is a direct ancestor of the double wall systems used in high-performance homes today. The Quonset hut, which would become famous in the military decades later, relied on the same inherent structural strength and wind-shedding properties of the arch that Janice had learned in the shipyards of Latvia. The prairie was an ocean of grass, ruled by a relentless wind. The first settlers arrived carrying the architectural memories of the forests and villages they had left behind. They built square houses with flat walls and pitched roofs, rigid shapes designed for a world of trees that broke the wind's power. On the open plains, these shapes were a liability. They stood in defiance of the wind, presenting the maximum possible resistance. And for their defiance, they were punished. They shuddered, leaked, and bled heat, forcing their inhabitants into a constant, exhausting war against the cold. Janus Kalnin's carried a different memory. He remembered the elegant, powerful curve of a ship's hull, a shape born from centuries of experience on the violent open water. A hull was not designed to fight the sea. It was designed to move through it, to shed its immense force, to remain whole and stable in a world of constant, overwhelming pressure. He looked at the prairie and saw the sea. He looked at the wind and saw the waves. And so he built a hull, not a fortress. A shape made for the sea knew how to stand against the prairie. It was more than a clever design. It was an act of translation, carrying a piece of hard-won wisdom from one world and setting it down in another, where it was needed most. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you believe these histories deserve to be remembered, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more. We'd be interested to read your thoughts in the comments below. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Any application of these or similar methods in modern contexts should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and professional engineering standards. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.